I had always been drawn to the idea of escaping into the wilderness, away from the noise and chaos of daily life. So when the opportunity arose to spend a few days alone in the woods, I jumped at the chance. I had been living in the city for the past few years, and the pressure of work, deadlines, and constant social media noise had started to eat away at me. My mind was cluttered, and I felt like I needed a break. A real break. Somewhere I could just be alone, reflect, and unwind. The cabin I rented was nestled deep in a secluded part of the mountains, about 3 hours from the nearest town. It was old but sturdy, sitting on the edge of a small forest clearing. The brochure had promised a tranquil setting with no neighbors for miles. The moment I read that, I knew this was the place. I didn't want to deal with anyone, not even a few curious hikers. I wanted silence, just me, the cabin, and the wilderness. The reviews spoke highly of it. Cozy, charming, and remote. I left the hustle and bustle of the city behind and drove up early one Friday morning. The sun had barely risen, and the drive was peaceful, winding through forests and over hills, the road almost empty. As I climbed higher into the mountains, I started to feel the weight of the city slip away, replaced by the calming sensation of isolation. By the time I reached the cabin, it was still early afternoon, and the sun was shining brightly through the trees. The cabin stood in a quiet hollow, surrounded by towering pines. I could see the small creek flowing just past the property, its water shimmering in the sunlight. It was beautiful, exactly what I had hoped for. The cabin was small but well kept. It had a stone fireplace, a modest kitchen, and a single bedroom. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it had a certain charm. I unpacked my things, set my bag on the bed, and made myself comfortable. The air outside smelled fresh, earthy, and clean, so different from the sterile, recycled air of the city. After a while, I decided to take a short walk around the area to stretch my legs and explore. The forest was dense, and the trail that led into the woods was faint but visible. I wasn't planning to go far. I just wanted to get a feel for the surroundings, see what wildlife might be nearby, and familiarize myself with the landscape. The path led me up a small hill, from where I could see the entire hollow. The cabin seemed so small from up here, surrounded by trees, with the creek running through it like a ribbon of silver. But as I stood there, I noticed something that immediately caught my attention. In the distance, through the trees, there was a small building. At first, I thought it was another cabin, maybe a neighbor's place, but there was something off about it. It was old, decrepit, and hidden in a way that made it seem abandoned. It wasn't mentioned in the rental information, and there was no sign of any other cabins in the area. It was too far to reach in one short walk, but I made a mental note of it. I was curious but decided to leave it for tomorrow. That evening, I settled in by the fire and had a simple meal. The quiet was almost overwhelming, but in a good way. I hadn't realized how much I missed silence until I was finally surrounded by it. I spent the rest of the evening reading and listening to the occasional creak of the old wooden beams in the cabin. As the night deepened, the wind picked up slightly, causing the trees outside to sway gently. The shadows in the cabin grew longer, and the firelight flickered and danced. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was just the isolation, the unfamiliar setting, but I couldn't help feeling like I was being watched. I dismissed the feeling. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. That night, I went to bed early. The bed was comfortable, the sheets crisp, and the quiet made it easy to fall asleep. But I woke up in the middle of the night, suddenly alert. I didn't hear anything at first, but there was a presence in the air. Something not quite right. It wasn't a noise that woke me, but a sense that something was out there, outside the cabin, lurking in the shadows. I tried to ignore it, but my heart began to race, and I lay there, staring at the ceiling in the dark. Then I heard it, a soft rustling sound, like footsteps on leaves, just outside my window. My pulse quickened as I listened. The sound came closer, circling the cabin. Then it stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear any other sounds. For a long moment, there was nothing. Absolute silence. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something larger like a bear, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. After a few minutes, I got up and crept over to the window, trying to peer through the gaps in the blinds. But all I saw were the trees swaying in the wind, their branches creaking in the night. Nothing unusual. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. But there was no more noise. No footsteps, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. The next morning, I brushed it off as a combination of my nerves and the unfamiliar environment. The following day, I decided to venture closer to the mysterious building I had seen from the hill. The walk was longer than I expected, the forest dense with underbrush and tangled roots. The silence of the woods was oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was nearby, following my every move. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me flinch. Eventually, I reached the building. It wasn't a cabin at all, but an old, abandoned barn. Its wood weathered and gray, almost blending into the forest. The door was slightly ajar, and there was a rusted metal sign hanging above it, but it was too faded to read. The barn was clearly very old, and the sense of decay was almost palpable. I stepped inside cautiously, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air inside was musty, filled with the smell of old wood, rust, and damp earth. As I looked around, I saw remnants of what might have been tools, piles of rotting hay, and other debris scattered across the floor. It didn't feel like a place that had been abandoned for years. It felt as if someone had been here recently. My curiosity got the better of me, and I walked deeper inside. That's when I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the dirt floor, large ones, leading to a small back room that I hadn't seen at first. I approached the room slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. As I neared the entrance, I noticed a faint light coming from within. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The back room was small, and it had a single old light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting a dim, flickering glow. On the walls were strange marks, deep scratches, like something had been dragged along them repeatedly. The floor was covered in dust, but there was something else that made my stomach twist. A few things scattered on the floor, old ropes, chains, and a dirty mattress in one corner. My mind raced with thoughts of what this could mean. I felt a growing sense of dread crawl up my spine. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut with a force that made the walls vibrate. I spun around, panic setting in. The room was suddenly too small, too suffocating. The air felt thick, like it was closing in around me. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if someone or something was holding it closed. I took a step back, my mind racing, but I couldn't figure out what to do. I was trapped. Then, from somewhere in the dark corners of the barn, I heard something. A slow, rhythmic sound, like breathing, but not my own. I don't remember how long I stood there, frozen, but the sound grew louder, closer. I could feel the presence in the room with me. Then, finally, the door creaked open. I didn't wait to see who or what was on the other side. I ran. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I was safely back at the cabin, heart pounding, every nerve on edge. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. I locked every door and window and stayed inside the rest of the night, terrified to step outside. The next morning, I left. I didn't bother packing up my things properly. I grabbed what I could and made a mad dash back to the car. I didn't look at the barn again. I didn't care to know what had been in there or who had been following me. All I knew was that the peaceful retreat I had hoped for had turned into a nightmare. The drive back to town was a blur, and I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. I couldn't explain it, but that place, the cabin, the barn, the feeling of being watched, it stayed with me. And every time I think about it, I still feel that chill in my spine, that weight of something lurking just beyond the edges of my memory. The woods are beautiful, yes, but there's a darkness to them, something not meant to be understood, only feared. I never went back. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. I had spent plenty of weekends in the woods, camping in national parks or tucked into quiet state forests, hiking, fishing, just being outside. It was something I always found solace in, but this trip felt different. I can't quite explain why, but as soon as I arrived at the cabin, I felt like something was wrong. I had found the cabin online. It seemed perfect for a quiet weekend away from the city, surrounded by nature. Tucked away in the mountains, it was a small, rustic cabin with no other houses for miles. The listing promised peace and solitude, with a small pond nearby and miles of trails to explore. I was looking for isolation, away from work and the noise of daily life. I rented the cabin for 3 days, expecting nothing more than a quiet retreat. The cabin itself was old, but well kept. A stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and one cozy bedroom. The only real thing that struck me as odd was the location. The drive to get there was long, winding, steep roads surrounded by dense trees, and when I arrived, the place was almost unnervingly still. There were no neighbors, no sounds of other people or animals, just silence. It wasn't an eerie silence, but a quiet that made me wonder if this place had ever been visited much at all. The trees were thick, and the cabin itself was nestled between them like it was trying to hide. The porch creaked as I stepped up to the door, and the smell of wood and dust filled the air. I pulled out the keys the property manager had left in a lockbox, unlocked the door, and entered. Felt exactly as I had imagined it would. A perfect escape. The first day was spent exploring. I wandered along a trail behind the cabin that led up to a small ridge. The view from there was stunning, miles of treetops stretching out to the horizon, with no sign of civilization. It was exactly the kind of peace I'd been craving. I returned to the cabin just as the sun was setting, the golden light filtering through the trees. Felt good, the fresh air, the physical exertion. That night, I lit a fire in the stone hearth and cooked a simple meal, pasta and some canned vegetables. Afterward, I settled into the armchair near the fire with a book. The cabin was quiet, but not in a way that made me uneasy. It felt homey, even though I was miles from any real home. But that changed on the second night. I had gone to bed early, tired from the hike. The bed was comfortable, and the sound of the wind outside was soothing. But at around midnight, I woke to a sound, faint scratching. I blinked into the darkness, unsure of what it was. The noise was coming from outside. It was subtle at first, almost like the sound of a branch brushing against the cabin wall. Then it stopped. I waited, straining my ears. The wind outside had picked up, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I figured it was just a tree or maybe an animal moving around, and tried to go back to sleep, but the sound came again. This time it was clearer, scratching, like claws dragging against wood. It was rhythmic, deliberate, not the usual noises of the woods I'd grown used to. I didn't get out of bed to check. I had no idea what it was, but I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel. After a few more moments, the sound stopped, and the night grew quiet again. I eventually fell back asleep, but it was a restless sleep. I woke up multiple times throughout the night, each time with the unsettling feeling that something was wrong. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I spent the morning walking the trails again, trying to keep my mind off the strange noises from the night before. But as the sun set again and I made my way back to the cabin, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. The air was still heavy. I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. That night, I took extra precautions. I locked all the windows and doors before settling into the chair by the fire. I didn't want to admit it, but I was on edge. The scratching sounds had been unnerving, and the isolation was beginning to feel less like a peaceful retreat and more like a trap. As I sat there, a strange thought occurred to me. I had rented the cabin for 3 days, but I had never met anyone else associated with the place. There was no check-in, no one to meet me on arrival. I had only spoken to the property manager briefly over the phone. Something about that struck me as off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I spent the next few hours distracted by the fire, pushing those thoughts aside. But around 11 p.m., the scratching returned. Only this time it was much louder, more insistent, like something or someone was trying to get inside. I froze. I didn't want to believe it, but I grabbed the flashlight from the table and made my way to the door. I was terrified, my mind racing with thoughts of who or what could be outside. I slowly pulled the curtain aside and looked out into the dark, trying to peer through the small window. Nothing, just trees, their dark shapes swaying in the wind. I couldn't see anything clearly, but I had the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't imagining it. The scratching had stopped. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the dark, waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move. My mind kept playing tricks on me. Every creak of the cabin, every shift in the wind felt like something was watching me. The next morning, I woke to the sound of something else. A heavy thud came from somewhere inside the cabin. My heart leaped into my throat as I jumped up, searching for the source of the sound. But the cabin was as I had left it, except for one thing. The window in the bedroom had been opened, just a crack. I know I had locked it. I had checked everything before going to bed. My thoughts were racing as I tried to convince myself that maybe the wind had pushed it open. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I had to leave. I packed up my gear, feeling the weight of every movement. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was just outside, waiting for me to make a mistake. I rushed through it, throwing things into my bag without caring about the order. My hands were shaking, but I managed to lock the door behind me and make my way to the car. The drive back to civilization was long, my mind constantly drifting back to that cabin, to the strange noises, the open window. It was a drive I couldn't do fast enough. By the time I got home, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, but the memories of that cabin lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something waiting for someone to walk into that isolated, silent place, something that wasn't quite human. I haven't been back since, and I doubt I ever will. I've always enjoyed the isolation of the woods. Growing up, I'd spend my weekends hiking and camping in remote areas, far from the prying eyes of the world. But the trip I took a few years ago was different. It wasn't just a weekend retreat into the wilderness. It was a complete break. I decided to spend a full week in a small cabin I found online. It was nestled deep in the heart of the mountains, miles away from the nearest town, and I couldn't have been more excited. The cabin was old, built decades ago with weathered logs and a stone chimney that had long since stopped smoking. The listing described it as a place for the truly adventurous. The photos showed it surrounded by thick forest, with nothing but hills and trees as far as the eye could see. It sounded perfect, secluded, peaceful, and a bit rugged. Just what I was looking for. I packed up my gear, gathered all the supplies I'd need, and headed out. The journey took longer than I expected. The road became increasingly narrow as I approached, turning into a dirt path that wound through the woods. My car scraped the sides of the trees, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. I had a map, but after a while, the path seemed to disappear into the forest, forcing me to rely on nothing but my sense of direction. Eventually, I parked my car at the end of the trail and set off on foot. It was late in the afternoon by the time I finally reached the cabin, and the sun was already dipping low in the sky. The cabin itself was exactly what I had imagined. Quaint, with a small porch and a single window that looked out over the hollow. The surrounding forest was dense, the trees so close that they seemed to press in on the cabin from all sides. The air was still, and the only sounds were the occasional chirp of a distant bird or the rustle of leaves in the wind. There was no one else around for miles, just me and the wilderness. Felt like the perfect escape. After unpacking my things, I took a moment to admire the view from the porch. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground, and the sky turned a deep shade of purple. The cabin had a wood-burning stove inside, and I got it going to ward off the chill. There was a pile of dry firewood stacked next to the cabin, so I knew I'd have plenty for the evening. The air smelled crisp, the kind of scent that made you feel alive. As night fell, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the stars begin to appear in the sky. It was peaceful, more than I had expected. For a while, I didn't think about anything else. Just the stillness of the forest and the feeling of being completely alone. But that peace didn't last. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound, something scraping against the walls of the cabin. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer brushing against the cabin in the night. But then it happened again, louder this time, followed by a thud that rattled the window. I froze. I didn't know what to make of it. My first instinct was to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind or an animal. But the sound continued, louder now and more deliberate. It wasn't random. Someone or something was out there. My heart began to race, and my thoughts started to spiral. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way to the door. I stood there for a moment listening, but the sounds had stopped. Everything was quiet again, eerily still. I opened the door just a crack, shining the light out into the dark. There was nothing. The forest was as quiet as ever. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move. Just for a second, nothing more than a flicker. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I locked the bolt, and for a moment, I just stood there, trying to gather my thoughts. The shadow had moved too quickly for me to make out what it was, but I had the feeling that something was watching me. I didn't sleep much that night. The rest of the hours dragged on, every creak of the cabin's floorboards sending me into a panic. I kept expecting the door to burst open or the walls to shake with another thud, but nothing happened. By morning, I was exhausted, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to my nerves, the isolation getting to me. After all, I'd been alone for too long, with nothing but the trees for company. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. It was the only way to distract myself from the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I took a hike up the hill behind the cabin, where the forest opened up to reveal a breathtaking view of the valley below. I could see the tops of the trees stretching out in every direction, with no sign of any human presence. There were no roads, no buildings, no signs of civilization. It was exactly what I wanted, complete isolation. But when I returned to the cabin later in the afternoon, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it before I left. My stomach sank. There was no way the wind had done that. Nothing had moved the door. I pushed it open slowly, my heart racing. The inside was just as I had left it, except for one thing. The fireplace had been disturbed. The logs that had been neatly stacked were now scattered, as though someone had been rummaging through them. I searched the cabin, feeling my anxiety spike with every creaking floorboard and rustling curtain. Nothing seemed out of place, but the unease lingered. Someone had been here. Someone had been in my cabin. That night, I decided to stay alert. I set up a camp chair near the window with a flashlight and my knife within arm's reach. I tried to keep calm, telling myself that I was overreacting, that I had imagined the door being opened, that it was just an animal pushing it slightly. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. There was no logical explanation for what had been happening. The hours dragged on. I'd hear small noises, scraping, tapping, but nothing concrete. I kept waiting for something more to happen, but nothing did. By the time the sun started to rise, I was exhausted and on edge, but the fear hadn't subsided. The following day, I packed my things. I was done. The isolation that had once felt peaceful now seemed suffocating. I couldn't ignore the feeling of eyes watching me, the sense that something was lurking just out of sight. I didn't care to know what it was. As I left, I took one last look at the cabin. The door was still slightly ajar, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the window, watching me from the shadows. I couldn't be sure. It was probably my tired mind playing tricks on me. I never went back to that cabin. Looking back, I'll never know what truly happened. Was it someone playing a twisted game? An animal that had somehow gotten inside? Or was it something else entirely? Something darker, something I shouldn't have tried to understand? I don't know. But I do know this. The wilderness is quiet, yes, but it's not always peaceful. And sometimes, when you think you're truly alone, you're not. And some places are better left unexplored. I had always dreamed of getting away from it all, of spending a few days alone in a cabin, deep in the woods, where the only sounds were birds, wind, and the occasional rustle of leaves. That's how I ended up at that cabin, tucked away in the forest near a small town in upstate New York. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a place to unwind, disconnect from everything, and clear my head. I'd rented it for a long weekend, thinking it would be the perfect escape from the pressure of work, the chaos of city life, and the endless noise of people. The drive to the cabin had been long and winding. The paved road eventually gave way to gravel, then dirt, and finally a narrow, almost hidden path through the trees. The cabin itself was rustic but cozy, just as advertised. It sat on a small plot of land, surrounded by tall pines that swayed gently in the wind. No neighbors for miles, just wilderness. I could already feel the stress of my everyday life begin to melt away as I unpacked my gear and set up inside. It was the first evening that things started to feel a little off. I was sitting on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, the sky painted with colors of orange and purple. The quiet was peaceful, but there was something in the air that I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was the fact that the woods felt so alive around me. Every crackle of a twig, every whisper of wind through the trees, felt louder than it should. I shrugged it off as normal, being in such a remote place. As night fell, I lit a fire in the small stove inside the cabin. The warmth was comforting, and the flickering light from the flames cast long, dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The isolation was beginning to feel more oppressive than peaceful, but I was determined not to let it get to me. I made dinner, simple but satisfying, and then curled up on the couch with a book, trying to push away the feeling that I was being watched. Around 10 p.m., I heard the first noise. At first, it was just a faint rustling outside, like someone brushing against the trees. I paused, listening. It was only for a second, then silence. I figured it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, moving through the underbrush. But then, about 10 minutes later, I heard it again, a soft, dragging sound, something heavy scraping along the ground. I stood up, walking over to the window and peered out. The porch was empty. The trees were still. There was no sign of any animals. I shook my head, chalking it up to my imagination. After all, the woods were full of noises, especially at night. But the noises continued. At first, it was just the occasional rustle. Then, the scraping came again, closer this time, as if whatever was making the noise was circling the cabin. I could hear it clearly now, a dragging sound, like something or someone was pulling something heavy across the dirt. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't know what to think. The closest neighbors were miles away. No one should have been out here. I didn't have a phone signal, and there was no landline in the cabin. If someone was out there, I had no way to call for help. The noise stopped for a while, and the silence that followed felt almost suffocating. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or some other large creature. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I sat back down on the couch, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I told myself to relax. It could be a branch falling, a tree shifting in the wind, or any number of natural noises. But then, just as I was starting to convince myself it was nothing, I heard a faint knock at the door. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a loud knock, more like a gentle tap. But in the dead of night, in a cabin far from any other human, it was enough to make me jump to my feet. I stood there listening. My mind raced with possibilities. I thought about what to do, whether to open the door, whether to hide. The logical part of me told me to leave through the back door and head toward the woods, but I didn't want to make any noise and alert whoever was outside. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. I waited a few more minutes, straining my ears for any further sounds, but nothing came. I slowly walked over to the door, hesitating for a moment before looking out the small peephole. I saw nothing. The porch was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the light from inside the cabin. I exhaled in relief, but something still didn't sit right with me. For the next few hours, I kept the door locked and stayed inside. I had no idea who or what was outside, but I wasn't about to find out. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, the events replaying in my mind. Whoever or whatever had been out there, they were still out there. The next morning, I felt drained. I tried to shake off the lingering fear from the night before and decided to take a walk through the woods. It was still early, the sun barely peeking through the trees, and the air had a sharp, crisp feel to it. I figured I'd get some fresh air, clear my head, and hopefully convince myself that nothing strange had happened. As I walked along the path behind the cabin, I noticed something strange. There were fresh tracks in the dirt, leading away from the back of the cabin and disappearing into the trees. They were deep impressions, too deep for an animal and too scattered to be from a single person. The tracks looked like they had been made by someone dragging something heavy. My stomach dropped. I followed the tracks for a while, my feet crunching the dry leaves beneath me. The tracks led deeper into the woods, past the creek and toward a small hill where the ground sloped downward. There, near the edge of a small clearing, I found what had been dragged. A large, weathered wooden crate, half buried in the dirt, its edges splintered and worn. I stared at the crate for a long time, my mind racing with questions. What was inside? Who had dragged it out here? I tried to move it, but it was too heavy. The lid was cracked, and I could just make out the remnants of some faded writing on the side. But as I crouched down to get a better look, I heard something behind me. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, crunching the leaves underfoot. I turned around, but saw nothing. The woods were still, and for a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But then the footsteps came again, louder this time. I grabbed a nearby stick and stood up, my heart racing. This wasn't right. Something was very wrong. I hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. The fear that had been creeping up on me since the night before was now consuming me. I felt trapped, cornered, like something was watching me, waiting. That afternoon, I packed up my things. I couldn't stay here any longer. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, if it was all in my head, but something told me I wasn't safe. I left the cabin, heading back to the trailhead, my footsteps quick and uneven. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was no one. The woods were silent again, almost unnaturally so. When I finally reached my car, I didn't stop to look back. I got in, started the engine, and drove away, the cabin growing smaller in the rearview mirror. The further I got from the woods, the more I felt the weight lift from my chest. To this day, I don't know who had been out there that night. I don't know what was in that crate or why the tracks led toward the clearing. But one thing was certain: I would never return to that cabin again. The woods may be beautiful, but sometimes they hide things you're better off not knowing. It was the middle of winter when I decided to go on my first solo trip to a remote cabin in the mountains. I had always loved the idea of retreating into nature for a while, escaping from the world, and just having time to think. No distractions, no people, just me and the wilderness. I'd booked a cabin weeks before, an old, secluded place deep in the woods. It was rustic, isolated, and had no electricity. Exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear carefully. Enough food to last the week, a few books, and my trusty rifle. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I'd read enough to know that getting stranded in the wild could go south quickly. The cabin owner had given me directions over the phone. "Just follow the trail from the logging road," he said. "You'll see a big pine tree, and the cabin's just past that. No one else up there." That last part sounded perfect to me, solitude. I was looking forward to it, more than I had for anything in a long time. I made my way out of town on a cold Thursday morning, and after a long, bumpy drive, I reached the logging road. The snow was deep, but the road had been plowed. My truck slid a little as I turned onto the gravel trail, but I took it slow. By the time I found the pine tree and spotted the cabin in the distance, the sun was starting to set. I was a little nervous, though I wouldn't admit it to myself. The cabin was farther from civilization than I had thought. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I grabbed my bag, locked the truck, and started on foot to the cabin, following the trail as best I could. The snow crunched underfoot, the air sharp and cold, biting at my face. The tall trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, and the further I went, the more oppressive the silence became. There was no wind, no sound, not even the chirp of a distant bird. I thought it was odd, but I convinced myself that this was normal, isolated woods after all. When I finally reached the cabin, it was almost completely dark. The place was small but solid, made of weathered logs with a stone chimney rising from the roof. It was just as I had imagined: rustic, quiet, and private. The front porch had a small chair, the kind you'd imagine an old man sitting in to watch the world go by. But there was no old man in the chair. I fumbled for my key and unlocked the door, stepping inside. The smell of wood and must filled my nose. It wasn't unpleasant, just old. The living room had a fireplace, a worn leather couch, and a simple wooden table. A few chairs were scattered about, and in the corner stood a bookshelf filled with dusty novels and a couple of old board games. I turned on the gas lamp and set my pack down. It was cold inside, but I'd expected that. The cabin wasn't heated, but I'd brought enough wood to last the night. I set up the fire, unpacked my food, and cooked a quick dinner. Afterward, I settled into the couch with a book, the warmth of the fire crackling in the background. The sound of the flames was comforting, but as the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't place it, but there was something about the cabin that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the cabin itself, it was the surrounding woods. It felt like they were closing in, like they were watching me. By the time I blew out the gas lamp and crawled into bed, I was more anxious than I wanted to admit. The wind had picked up, and I could hear it howling outside, making the trees creak and groan. Every so often, a branch would scrape against the cabin's walls, making me jump. I lay awake for hours, staring into the dark, listening to the sounds of the wind and the occasional snap of branches outside. Then I heard something else, a knock. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps a tree branch tapping against the cabin. But then it came again, sharp and clear, from the front door. I froze, my heart racing. There was no one out here. I hadn't passed anyone on the trail, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I didn't move, couldn't. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. What if it was someone who had gotten lost in the snow? Someone who needed help? Or worse, someone who had been watching me? I grabbed my rifle from where I had left it by the bed, but I didn't make a sound. I stayed perfectly still, trying to listen for any movement outside. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Nothing. The knock didn't come again. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but when I finally dared to get out of bed, I tiptoed to the door and peered out through the small window by the door. There was no one. The snow outside had been untouched. No footprints, no sign of anyone. I exhaled slowly, trying to convince myself that it had been my imagination. Maybe it was the wind after all. I locked the door and returned to bed, my thoughts a jumbled mess. My nerves were on edge, but I eventually drifted into a restless sleep. The next day, I woke early. The sun was just rising, casting pale light through the cabin's small windows. The wind had died down, leaving the air still and crisp. I decided to go outside and gather more firewood, thinking the fresh air would clear my mind. The moment I stepped outside, I froze. There, in the fresh snow, were a set of footprints leading straight to the cabin. They were large, heavy prints like those of a man, and they stopped at the doorstep. I had checked the area before going to bed last night, and there had been no tracks. None. My heart began to race again. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. The footprints seemed to appear out of nowhere, leading up to the door, but then they stopped. The snow was pristine in every direction beyond the doorstep. I quickly gathered the firewood and went back inside. I wasn't sure what to make of the tracks, but they left me feeling more uneasy than before. Maybe it was just someone who had passed through earlier, I told myself. But the more I thought about it, the less I believed that. I spent the rest of the day inside, reading, trying to distract myself. But my mind kept drifting back to the footprints. Something didn't add up. As night fell, I locked the door and checked the windows, making sure everything was secure. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching. I sat near the fire, rifle in hand, my eyes flicking constantly to the darkened windows. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. This time, it was louder, more distinct. A scraping sound, like something dragging along the ground. I stood up and walked to the window, peering through the thin curtain. My breath caught in my throat when I saw what it was. There, just outside the cabin, was a figure. It was tall, almost impossibly tall, and it was hunched over, dragging something behind it. I couldn't see its face, but its movements were jerky, unnatural. It dragged something long and heavy, maybe a branch or a piece of wood, leaving long marks in the snow. I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering. Couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, thinking of every possible explanation, but none made sense. The scraping continued, moving around the cabin. I didn't wait for whatever it was to come any closer. I grabbed my rifle, bolted the door shut, and crouched in the corner, my back against the cold stone wall. Every muscle in my body was tense, waiting. Then the scraping stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, holding my breath. Finally, after what felt like hours, I dared to move. I slowly crept to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. When I opened it, the snow was undisturbed. The figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't even take time to properly clean up or gather the firewood. I just grabbed everything, jumped in my truck, and drove as fast as I could. To this day, I can't explain what happened out there. The footprints, the scraping, the figure, it doesn't make sense. Maybe it was someone playing a sick joke, or maybe I was just too far out in the wilderness, losing touch with reality. But whatever it was enough to keep me from ever returning to that cabin or any other alone again. I don't know if I'll ever go back to the woods. Part of me wants to forget everything, but another part of me wonders, what was it that I saw? It was early autumn when I decided to take a break from everything and spend some time alone in the mountains. I needed to disconnect, clear my mind, and get some fresh air away from the noise of work and city life. A cabin deep in the woods seemed like the perfect solution. I found a secluded spot online that was available for rent, far from any major trails or towns, and booked it. It was the kind of place that promised isolation. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just me, the forest, and some peace. I arrived at the cabin around midday. The drive had been longer than I expected, and the roads were narrow and winding. The trees crowded the sides of the road, their branches leaning out like hands reaching for the sky. The cabin itself was an old, two-story structure, built from weathered logs and surrounded by a thick wall of trees. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped out of the car, and the air smelled fresh, with the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. Inside, the cabin was rustic but charming. A wood stove sat in the corner with a small stack of firewood nearby. The furniture was worn but comfortable, and the kitchen was stocked with basic necessities. It was clear that the place had seen its share of guests, but it had been well maintained. I set my bags down by the door, took a deep breath, and smiled to myself. This was exactly what I needed. The first few hours were peaceful. I spent time unpacking and settling in, enjoying the quiet. I wandered around the property, which was surrounded by dense forest, and found a small creek that ran behind the cabin. The sound of the water was soothing, and I made a mental note to explore the area more thoroughly the next day. The solitude was exactly what I had hoped for. As dusk approached, I lit a fire in the stove to warm the cabin. Outside, the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the trees. I cooked a simple meal, sat down at the wooden table, and read a book. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the cabin. I felt relaxed, almost too relaxed, like the quiet had started to seep into my bones. But then, as night fully descended, I noticed something strange. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was an unsettling stillness outside. The usual nighttime sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the call of owls, the wind through the trees were absent. It was so silent that it almost felt unnatural. I brushed it off, assuming it was just my imagination. Maybe it was just a quiet night, or maybe the sound was being muffled by the thick canopy of trees around me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I finished my meal, cleaned up, and decided to go to bed early. The bedroom upstairs was small, with a low ceiling and a heavy quilt on the bed. I pulled the quilt up around me and turned off the light, letting the darkness wrap around me. For a while, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the occasional creak of the cabin settling. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept wandering back to the silence outside. Suddenly, I heard something, a soft thump. I froze, straining to listen. The thump came again, followed by a scraping sound. It was faint, but it was there. I sat up slowly, trying to calm my racing heart. It sounded like something or someone was moving around outside the cabin. I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows across the yard. First, I saw nothing, just the dark silhouette of the forest surrounding the cabin. But then, near the edge of the trees, I saw a figure. It was a man. He stood perfectly still, just outside the light from the cabin, half hidden by the shadows of the trees. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket and pants. His back was to me, and he seemed to be staring at the cabin, unmoving. My breath caught in my throat. What was he doing out there? I pulled away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was probably nothing, a hiker passing through or someone out looking for firewood. But I knew deep down that something wasn't right. The man hadn't moved for what seemed like forever, and there was something unsettling about the way he just stood there, staring. I backed away from the window and tried to think clearly. My mind raced with possibilities. Should I call the authorities? But I didn't have a phone signal, and even if I did, the nearest town was miles away. I didn't want to draw attention to myself by making noise, but I didn't want to just sit there and wait either. I decided to stay quiet, hoping the man would leave. I moved away from the window and checked the locks on the doors and windows, just to be sure. The cabin felt much smaller now, much more confined, as if the walls were closing in on me. The night seemed to drag on. Every little sound, every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees felt magnified. The man didn't leave. He just stood there motionless, as though he was waiting for something. Hours passed, and I still hadn't heard him leave. At some point, I must have drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't a restful sleep. Every time I awoke, I listened for any sign that he had gone, but the cabin was silent. When I woke up the next morning, the man was gone. I didn't know how long he had been out there, but he had disappeared by the time the first light of day crept through the trees. I didn't want to leave the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to check around the property, hoping to find something that would explain what had happened. The ground outside was soft, and I found footprints near the edge of the yard, large, heavy prints, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. They led toward the trees, then stopped abruptly, as though the person had vanished into thin air. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I wasn't sure what I had seen, or if it was real, but the presence of those footprints made it clear that something wasn't right. I packed up my things, leaving the cabin behind. As I walked down the trail back toward my car, I couldn't help but feel as if I was being watched. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man standing just out of sight, waiting for me to turn around. By the time I reached my car, I was shaken, but I was also relieved. The quiet, eerie stillness of the cabin had left me on edge, and I couldn't wait to leave the woods behind. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the man. I still don't know who he was or what he was doing out there, but I never returned to that cabin. Couldn't. The woods around it were too silent, too still, and I knew deep down that I had barely escaped something I couldn't understand. I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left that night. Would I have been able to sleep through it, or would he have come inside? I don't think I'll ever know. But one thing is certain. I learned to trust my instincts after that night. Some places, some people, are best avoided, no matter how inviting they may seem at first. I've always been a sucker for the idea of escaping the city, disconnecting from the constant noise, the rush, the never-ending demands of modern life. That's what led me to the cabin in the mountains that winter. I was 30 years old, tired of the everyday grind, and in desperate need of some solitude. So, I packed my things, rented an old cabin that was tucked away deep in the Appalachian foothills, and set out to experience what I thought would be a peaceful weekend in the wilderness. The drive was long, stretching across empty highways, winding up through forests and ridgelines. The closer I got to my destination, the more isolated the area seemed. I was starting to wonder if I'd made a mistake, but the thought of being alone in a cozy cabin, far from civilization, soothed me. The snow began to fall heavily as I reached the turnoff, dusting the trees and coating the ground in thick, powdery white. The cabin itself was small, rustic, and seemingly forgotten by time. A simple structure, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, a wooden porch with a couple of creaky chairs, and surrounded by dense, snow-covered forest. There was something charming about its old-fashioned charm, but at the same time, something unsettling about how still and isolated the place felt. No neighbors, no roads, just the sound of the wind howling through the trees. I unpacked my gear and settled in for the evening. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a warm glow across the room. The air was biting outside, but inside, I was comfortable. I cooked a simple meal, enjoying the calm and quiet, the kind of peace you can't find in the city. I felt like I could finally breathe again. But then, as I finished cleaning up, I heard something. A soft thud came from the porch. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch falling, but then I heard it again. Thud, thud, like someone was knocking gently at the door. I froze, listening intently. Who could be out there? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen another soul since arriving. The air outside was dead silent except for the sound of my own breathing. I moved cautiously toward the door. My hand hovered over the handle. For some reason, my instincts told me not to open it. But what was I supposed to do? Ignore it? I stood there for a few moments trying to figure out what to do. The sound of knocking or tapping came again, but this time louder, almost desperate. Reluctantly, I opened the door. Standing there in the snow was a man. He was older, thin, his face weathered by time and rough living. He wore an old, tattered coat, and his boots were covered in snow. His eyes darted back and forth, never meeting mine directly. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to say. My mind raced. Should I invite him in? Should I turn him away? But before I could speak, he took a step closer. "Got lost in the storm," he muttered, his voice rough, barely audible over the howling wind. "Cold, no food. Could you help me out?" I hesitated. Something felt off. But then again, it was a small mountain cabin. There were no other houses nearby, and he looked like he'd been out in the cold for a while. "All right," I said finally. "Come in just for a bit. Get out of the cold." He didn't need any further encouragement. He shuffled inside quickly, shedding his coat and boots at the door before taking a seat near the fire. I could feel his eyes on me, but I tried to ignore it. I gave him some water and made him a simple meal. He didn't say much while he ate, just sat there, staring into the fire. His presence was disconcerting, but I convinced myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. After dinner, I retreated to the far side of the cabin, trying to give him space. He sat there for hours, hardly moving. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the way he looked at me, but the quiet, the way he didn't speak unless spoken to. Eventually, I excused myself, telling him I needed to get some sleep. "Don't go to bed too early," he rasped, his voice low. "The storm's just getting worse. You don't know what's out there." I nodded, unnerved, but didn't respond. I climbed into the small loft above the main room, the only place to sleep, and tried to settle in. The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the trees, and the sound of the fire crackling below seemed to echo throughout the cabin. Couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, soft, scuffling sounds. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. The old man, he had moved around downstairs. I couldn't tell what he was doing, but the sound of his footsteps across the floor crept up the stairs. It wasn't the noise of someone getting comfortable for the night. It was deliberate, purposeful, like he was searching for something. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. The storm outside was playing tricks on my mind. But then the noise stopped, and I felt the weight of silence press in on me. I woke to something else, something that made my blood run cold. The cabin door was wide open. The wind howled through the entrance, carrying snowflakes with it. I jumped out of bed and rushed downstairs. The man was gone. His coat and boots were missing. The fire in the hearth was nearly out. But his presence, the feeling of someone being there, lingered. I looked around the room. No sign of forced entry, nothing disturbed. Just the absence of his presence. My mind raced. Could he have left during the night? If so, why? Or had something else happened? I decided to check outside. The snow had started to accumulate in thick layers. There were no tracks leading away from the door. That's when I noticed it. Up ahead, in the deep snow by the edge of the woods, there were signs of movement. Footprints, small but deliberate. The prints were too close together, like someone was trying to walk but was dragging their feet. I followed the trail, heart pounding in my chest. The tracks led to the woods, disappearing into the thick pines. I stood there, unsure of what to do. The snow was falling harder now, the storm intensifying. The man could be anywhere. I retreated back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the day inside, waiting. The storm raged outside, and I couldn't bring myself to leave. By nightfall, I heard nothing more. The following morning, the storm had passed. The snow was still thick, but the silence was almost deafening. I packed my things quickly, not wanting to spend another minute in that cabin. As I drove away, I passed the trail where the footprints had been. They were gone now, buried under fresh snow. The only signs of life were the trees swaying in the wind. I don't know who the man was. I don't know why he came to my cabin or what his intentions were. But the feeling I had when I looked out into the snow-covered woods told me that not everything in the mountains is as it seems. I've never gone back.